Just a waitress? No, she's my wife.
I thought she was just a waitress. I didn't know she was married to the devil. That was the first thing Preston Hawk said when the FBI questioned him about Salvatore Romano. But by then, it was already too late. Welcome back to Hidden Worth, where true power doesn't scream, it whispers. And this is no ordinary comeback. This is a black story about justice, silence, and what happens when the man you humiliate has the power to erase everything you built without touching a thing. If you haven't seen part 1, pause this and go watch it. Because today, we're not just telling a story, we're showing you what fear looks like when it wears a billion-dollar suit. Let's dive in. Preston Hawk used to be untouchable. His name sat on fortune covers, his deals shaped energy markets. He played golf with governors, shook hands with presidents, and built his empire brick by brick with arrogance as mortar. But he made one mistake. He poured coke on a black waitress. And that waitress? She wasn't just anyone. She was Zariah Monroe, wife of the most disciplined, most patient, most dangerous man Savannah's underworld had ever whispered about. See, Sal Romano wasn't out for revenge. He was out for remembrance. He wanted Preston to feel what Zariah felt, not just humiliation, but invisibility, the kind of pain that eats your name, your legacy, your peace. And Preston was unraveling. The whispers were getting louder. His board no longer trusted him. His enemies started circling like vultures, sensing blood beneath the wealth. But Preston wasn't done yet. Because men like him, they don't crumble quietly. They claw, they twist, they fight back. And now, for the first time, Sal is no longer the hunter. He's the one being watched. Because someone just stepped out of the shadows. And this time, the game has changed. So stay with us. Because Hidden Worth is about to reveal what happens when two men, built by pride and protected by silence, finally meet in the one arena neither of them can control. The truth. Like, share, and follow for the rest of this chapter. Because power doesn't always explode. Sometimes, it waits. And when it does, it rewrites everything. Zariah Monroe had never heard her name echo this loudly. Not in the streets, not on social media, not in the quiet corners of Savannah she used to walk without a second glance. But now she couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. They called her the woman in the Coke video. They called her a symbol, a hero, a voice for the unheard. Some even called her an icon. But to Zariah, it all felt unreal. The media didn't just report on her, they dissected her. Outfits, expressions, tone of voice analyzed frame by frame. Cable news used her face as background wallpaper. Talk show hosts debated her reaction. Was she too composed, too quiet, too polished to be real? And in all that noise, no one really asked how she felt. The truth? Zariah felt tired. Not just physically, but emotionally wrung out. Every interview request, every email, every offer for book deals or speaking tours came with the same unspoken condition. Be the story we want you to be. But Zariah didn't want to be anyone's story. She wanted to live. Still, she knew what was at stake. Black women had been silenced for centuries, made invisible, even in moments of pain. She couldn't pretend this wasn't bigger than her now. So she kept showing up. To schools, to forums, to panels where young girls stared at her like she was what hope looked like. She smiled. She spoke with grace, but inside, she wrestled with something heavier than fame. Responsibility. Sal saw it too. One night, he found her staring at her own face on the front page of a newspaper, her fingers gripping the edge like it might burn through. "You're allowed to take a break, you know," he said softly. Zariah didn't answer right away. Then she whispered, "If I stop, will they forget what he did?" Sal stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. If they do, they were never listening. But deep down, he knew the pressure was building, not from the press, from something darker. Someone had started asking questions, not about Zariah, but about Sal, his past, his power, his connections. And in the middle of it all, Zariah stood calm, still, centered like the eye of a storm. But even the quietest storms can rip a house apart. And somewhere beyond the camera flashes, something was coming. something neither of them saw coming. Preston Hawk had never been one to wait for the storm to pass. He built his empire by striking first, controlling the board before anyone else even saw the game. So when his public apology failed to repair the damage, when whispers about Salvatore Romano started spreading through the city's upper circles, Preston did what he always did when cornered. He picked up the phone and called someone who didn't show up on Forbes lists. "You still do the quiet work?" he asked. The voice on the other end didn't answer immediately. Then, "For the right price." And just like that, Preston made a move not even his legal team knew about. No lawsuits, no press conferences. This wasn't about reputation anymore. This was about control. He wanted dirt. On Sal, on Zariah, on anyone who had ever shaken hands with either of them. He wanted records, rumors, arrest reports, even sealed ones. If Sal was hiding something, Preston would find it. And if he couldn't find it, he'd create it. What he didn't realize was that this wasn't corporate war anymore. This was personal. The investigator Preston hired wasn't just a digger, he was a fixer. The kind of man who specialized in manufacturing leverage, fake witnesses, forged evidence, paid accusations. And the target? Zariah. The plan was cruel and simple. Discredit her, paint her as a manipulator, a woman using her husband's name to milk victimhood for money and media attention. Make people question her story, her marriage, her past. Truth is just a version of perception, Preston told his team in a closed-door meeting. If we shape the narrative, we win. But what he didn't understand, what his power-blinded arrogance never let him see, was that Sal wasn't watching from the sidelines. Sal had ears in places Preston didn't even know existed. Bartenders, drivers, bankers who owed him favors from another lifetime. And when the first fake lead surfaced on a gossip blog suggesting Zariah had staged the coke incident for clout, it didn't take long for Sal to trace the source. It all pointed back to one place: Preston's office. That night, Preston poured himself a drink, smug and satisfied. He had no idea that across the city, a man was already preparing his next move, not with lawyers, not with influencers, but with something much more dangerous: memory. Because Sal hadn't survived the underworld by playing fair. He survived by never playing the same game twice. It started with a podcast. A low-budget independent show based in Atlanta hosted by a former journalist who now spent his nights unraveling corporate corruption. He hadn't planned to touch the Hawk scandal. But someone sent him a flash drive. No return address, no note, just one file, labeled, "Worth Knowing." The journalist hit play. What he heard changed everything. A phone call. Preston's voice, sharp, calculating, speaking to someone off the grid. "I don't care how you do it," he said on the recording. "Find something, make something. I want that woman buried in headlines." It was clear, cold, intentional. And it was the one thing Preston hadn't planned for: proof. The journalist didn't release it right away. He fact-checked, ran it through audio authentication, triple-checked the timestamps. Then, on a Thursday morning, he published a special episode titled "The Billionaire, the Waitress, and the Lie." Within hours, it exploded. The media turned on Preston faster than he could respond. Reporters who once begged for quotes now demanded explanations. Civil rights organizations flooded social media, calling for criminal investigation. Sponsors cut ties. But the biggest shift? Public opinion. People who once doubted Zariah, who called her too perfect, too composed, too quiet, began to see her not as a symbol, but as a target. A woman who had been hunted twice, first by humiliation, then by sabotage. And now, the world knew the truth. Zariah didn't want revenge. She wanted space to breathe. Sal didn't want chaos. He wanted peace to return to his wife's name. But Preston had lit a match in a room full of gas. And the explosion had begun. At home, Zariah sat quietly as the podcast played over the Bluetooth speaker. Her phone buzzed non-stop, messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, apologies, gratitude, even some who admitted they'd believed the lies. She looked at Sal. His face was unreadable. "You knew this would happen," she whispered. He nodded once. He played a dirty game. I just reminded him, some games have watchers. Zariah closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, her chest loosened. Not because the world had changed, but because the mask had cracked. The truth had stepped into the light. And truth, once seen, can't be unseen. But this wasn't the end. Not even close. Because Preston Hawk had nothing left to lose. And men with nothing to lose? They're the most dangerous of all. Salvatore Romano never raised his voice. He didn't have to. Power, when it's real, doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly. And when it moves, things happen. The podcast had exposed Preston, but Sal knew better than to trust the court of public opinion. Outrage fades, headlines shift, people forget. So he did what he used to do back when his name made grown men whisper. He called in the quiet ones. Men and women who owed him favors, not from loyalty but from survival. A retired judge in Atlanta, a tech executive in DC, an ex-cop turned data analyst. Even a high-end florist in New York who used to move more than flowers. Each of them received a call. No threats, no money, just 3 words. It's time again. And they moved. One sent sealed court records anonymously to the state bar, exposing Preston's history of silencing former employees through hush agreements. Another contacted international regulators about environmental violations hidden inside Hawk Energy's offshore subsidiaries. And the most brilliant strike? An untraceable leak to a Wall Street whistleblower group exposing falsified energy output data that Preston had used to inflate his company's valuation during a recent funding round. Within days, the dominoes fell. Hawk Energy's stock plummeted. Investors bailed. The SEC launched a formal inquiry. Preston's face, once plastered across business magazines, now filled news tickers alongside phrases like fraud, manipulation, and collapse. Sal didn't touch a single thing. He just opened old doors and let the truth walk out. At his home, Zariah watched it all unfold, not with vengeance in her eyes, but quiet exhaustion. "Is this justice?" she asked. Sal poured her a cup of tea and sat beside her. "It's survival," he said. "He tried to destroy what we built. I'm just making sure he never tries again." But even as the world turned against Preston, Sal remained vigilant. Because a man like Preston, stripped of his fortune, stripped of his public armor, didn't disappear. He evolved. Somewhere behind closed doors, Sal knew his old enemy wasn't retreating. He was reloading. And that meant this wasn't a victory. It was a warning. The war had just entered a new phase, and the next strike wouldn't come from the front. It would come from behind. It happened in the place least expected. Not a courtroom, not a dark alley, not even behind the steel doors of a private boardroom. It happened in a bookstore. A quiet, sunlit corner of Savannah. The same place where Sal first met Zariah years ago, back when she was browsing Italian poetry, and he was just a stranger in a worn blazer. Sal had been coming there lately, often, as if the past somehow offered more peace than the present. But that day, the past caught up with him. Preston walked in like he owned the place. Not in a suit. Not with bodyguards. Just a plain gray sweater, designer jeans, and a jaw clenched tight enough to crack. Sal didn't stand up. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at the man who had tried to destroy his wife and calmly turned a page in his book. "You think you won?" Preston asked, his voice low, shaking. Sal looked up slowly. "I think," he said, "you're here because you know you didn't." Preston pulled up a chair without asking and sat across from him. "No cameras here," he said. "No microphones, just you and me." Sal nodded. "And that's your mistake." Preston leaned forward. "I lost everything because of you." Sal tilted his head. "No, Preston. You lost everything because you believed you were untouchable, because you mistook cruelty for power, and because you thought a woman like Zariah was invisible." Preston's eyes darkened. "You humiliated me. You stripped me bare." "No," Sal replied. "You did that to yourself." A tense silence. Then Preston smirked. "You know what I've realized, Romano? Men like us, we don't end each other. We outlast each other." Sal closed his book and stood. He looked Preston in the eye, not with anger, but something colder. Pity. "You're not the first man to try and bury a lion," Sal said, "but you'll be the last one who ever tries it with mine." And with that, Sal walked out. Preston didn't follow. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was the hunter or the hunted. And in that quiet, filled with the smell of old paper and fresh coffee, something became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just a personal feud. It was a collision course. And the next time they met, one of them would walk away with more than a bruised ego. One of them would walk away with everything. Zariah stood outside the weathered house in Atlanta, her fingers tightening around the small envelope in her hand. It had been over a decade since she last walked this street, long before she met Sal, before the luxury cars and the camera flashes. Back then, this house wasn't just bricks and siding. It was survival. It was noise. It was pain. And now, for reasons even she couldn't fully explain, she'd come back. Inside, nothing had changed. The faded rug in the hallway, the broken lamp still taped at the base, the chipped photo frame of a girl with two wide eyes and two tight braids. Her mother wasn't home. She rarely was, even when Zariah was young. But that wasn't the point. Zariah wasn't there to confront anyone. She was there to remind herself of something, that she had already survived worse than Preston Hawk. She sat on the old couch, ran her fingers over the cracked fabric, and let the silence wrap around her like it used to when she was a girl, pretending she didn't hear the yelling through the walls. This place didn't hold her anymore. It no longer owned her fear. But it did hold her truth. Because this was where she learned how to smile through pain, how to speak calmly in chaos, how to stay standing when the world tried to shove her down. She didn't just rise because she met Sal. She rose because she refused to stay broken. Later that night, she found herself staring at a mirror in her hotel room. No makeup, hair loose, eyes tired but sharp. She spoke quietly, not to herself but to the girl she used to be. "You made it out, and now, you don't run." It wasn't a declaration, it was a promise. The next morning she returned to Savannah. Stronger, clearer. And with her came the envelope, a stack of letters she had written to herself over the years. Letters full of doubt, anger, dreams she thought were too big for a girl from nowhere. Now, she planned to turn them into something more. A book. Not about Preston, not about the Coke incident, not even about Sal, but about the unseen battles so many women fight every day. She would title it simply, "Still Standing." And in doing so, Zariah wouldn't just be a symbol. She would be a voice. One born in silence, but never silenced again. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was precision. Sal Romano didn't believe in dramatic finishes. The best takedowns, he used to say, were the ones that left no trace, only silence. So when the time came for his final move against Preston Hawk, it didn't arrive with fire or fury. It arrived in a manila envelope. No logo, no name, just a simple courier dropped to the offices of the U.S. Attorney's office in downtown Atlanta. Inside were 5 documents. Each one connected dots that no one in the press had pieced together. A series of shell companies tied to Hawk Energy. Offshore bank accounts that funneled unreported income through the Cayman Islands. Emails between Preston and a foreign minister detailing bribes disguised as consulting fees. It wasn't just unethical. It was federal crime. And it wasn't fabricated. It was real. Pulled from Preston's own servers, quietly hacked by someone Sal once saved from a prison sentence in Naples. This wasn't street justice. This was systemic collapse. Within 48 hours, federal agents raided Preston's penthouse. Suits, laptops, phones, his assistant crying in the hallway. Preston, still in a robe, sipping coffee, pretending none of it was real. But it was. The headlines that followed were merciless. Billionaire Energy CEO under federal investigation. From boardroom to backroom deals, the fall of Preston Hawk. Zariah didn't smile when she saw the news. Neither did Sal. This wasn't joy. This was closure. For too long, men like Preston operated behind a wall of influence, hurting people like Zariah without consequence. That wall had finally cracked, and it was Sal who placed the last brick. That night, He stood alone in his study, staring at a photo of Zariah holding her first published book still standing. He whispered, "Now, maybe, you can finally rest." But even as the storm settled, Sal knew peace wouldn't last forever. He had just made the biggest power move of his post-mafia life. And power, like blood, attracts predators. He didn't regret it, but he knew what came next. A new enemy, a deeper game, and perhaps a cost neither he nor Zariah had prepared for. Because when you strike a king, you'd better not miss. And Preston Hawk? He wasn't done yet. Preston Hawk used to believe that reputation was everything, that no matter what storm came, as long as his name stayed clean in headlines, he was untouchable. But headlines lie. Now, his name was everywhere, and it wasn't clean anymore. The federal raid was only the beginning. His private files were exposed. Investors dropped him like a virus. The board of Hawk Energy held an emergency vote and removed him as CEO within 72 hours. It wasn't a press release, it was an execution. His face disappeared from magazine covers. Invitations to charity galas stopped arriving. People who once toasted champagne with him now crossed the street to avoid being associated. And the worst part? He still didn't think he had done anything wrong. Sitting alone in his penthouse, the same one that once hosted governors and tech billionaires, Preston watched the news play his downfall like a Netflix docuseries. He paced. He ranted. He threw a whiskey glass at the wall and shouted, "I built this city." But the city had moved on. Zariah's name trended daily on social media. Her book, Still Standing, hit the bestseller list within a week. Interviews, op-eds, podcasts, her voice was everywhere. And it was steady, calm, unshaken. And Sal? Sal never spoke publicly. He didn't need to. Preston knew where the pressure came from, knew who had orchestrated the fall. And yet, he couldn't touch him. Not in court, not in the media, not in the shadows. Sal had played chess. Preston had played checkers. And now, checkmate. Even his own family fractured. His wife filed for divorce. His kids stopped answering his calls. His attorneys, once loyal to a fault, began discussing plea deals behind his back. The isolation grew louder than the noise ever had. And as the walls of his empire collapsed around him, Preston did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He cried. Not for the money, not for the power, but for the identity he had built piece by piece out of arrogance, control, and the belief that he was above consequences. He wasn't. And now, the world saw it. One morning, a former colleague found him sitting on a park bench in Midtown, looking 10 years older, wearing the same gray sweater he had on at the bookstore confrontation. He didn't speak, just nodded, as if to say, "I finally understand." But understanding doesn't erase damage. It doesn't rebuild broken trust. And it doesn't undo what was done. Preston Hawk, the billionaire, was gone. All that remained was a man with a name no one wanted to say out loud anymore. And a silence that followed him like a shadow. The auditorium was packed. Rows of students, faculty, and community members filled every seat, some even standing along the walls, notebooks in hand, cameras ready. They weren't there for a politician, not for a celebrity, not for a business tycoon. They were there for Zariah Monroe, the same woman who once stood silently in a soaked Waitress uniform, Coca-Cola dripping down her arm, dignity clinging tighter than her dress. The same woman who now walked on stage to a standing ovation, confident, graceful, and untouchable in the way only those who've been broken and rebuilt can be. She stood behind the podium for a moment before speaking. No teleprompter, no script, just her truth. "When I was 19, she began, "I applied to this very university." The room went still. I got rejected. A few murmurs, a few exchanged glances. Not because of my grades, not because I wasn't qualified, but because I couldn't afford the interview trip and I missed the in-person requirement. That was it. She smiled not with bitterness, but with clarity. Life has a funny way of bringing you back to the places that once closed their doors. She paused. Back then, I thought silence was strength, that if I just kept my head down, worked hard, smiled, and stayed out of the way, the world would eventually see my worth. A longer pause this time. I was wrong. The room didn't move. Silence isn't strength. Silence is what they count on. It's what gives them power. A few heads nodded. A student in the front wiped her cheek. I didn't ask to be made a symbol. I didn't ask to have my pain go viral. But here we are. And since I've been given this platform, I've made one decision. She leaned forward, locking eyes with a student in the back who had been recording from the start. I will never let another young black woman walk into a room and feel like she has to shrink. Applause erupted, not out of politeness but recognition. Because what Zariah carried now wasn't just her own story. It was the weight of generations before her, the voice of those still struggling, the hope of those still waiting. She wrapped up her speech with quiet fire. You don't have to be loud to be powerful, but you do have to speak. You do have to show up. You do have to take up space, especially in rooms that were never built for you. When she stepped down from the podium, the applause didn't stop. And as she walked past the front row, a professor placed a sealed envelope into her hand. It read, "Honorary Doctorate Nomination." Zariah smiled. Not because she needed validation, but because she had become the kind of woman the world could no longer ignore. The coffee shop was quiet. Not upscale, not trendy. Just old wood floors, chipped mugs, and the kind of silence that felt intentional. Sal Romano was already there when Preston walked in. No entourage, no cameras, no headlines chasing them this time. Preston looked thinner, not broken but worn down. His shoulders sagged in a way that told the truth his words never had. He walked over and sat down without being asked. Neither man spoke for the first minute. The only sound between them was the slow hum of an old ceiling fan and the clink of a spoon stirring sugar into Sal's espresso. Finally, Preston spoke. "Why now?" Sal didn't look up. "Because it's over." Preston scoffed quietly. "Over? My company's gone. My name's poison. My kids won't even return my calls. And you. I didn't take your family from you," Sal interrupted, finally meeting his eyes. "You did that. With every decision, every word, every time you looked at someone like my wife and saw less." Preston looked away. Sal leaned forward, his voice lower. "I didn't come here for revenge. I came to end the cycle." Preston gave a bitter laugh. "You think I'm afraid of you?" Sal shook his head. "You're not afraid. That's the problem. You're incapable of fear, of humility, of seeing yourself for what you really are." Preston's fingers tightened around the mug in front of him. "Then tell me, Romano, why didn't you destroy me completely? You had the power. You still do." Sal sat back, calm as ever. "Because people like you destroy yourselves. I just made sure the world watched." The silence between them stretched. Then Sal added, "You poured a drink on a woman you thought was beneath you. But that woman was the foundation of everything I've built. And when you cracked her dignity, you cracked your legacy." Preston's face hardened. "You're just a thug in a suit. And you're just a coward in a mirror," Sal replied, standing. He left a $20 bill on the table, even though neither of them had ordered anything. Before he walked out, he looked back once. "You ever think about rebuilding? Do it the right way. Not for power, not for redemption, but so your kids have something left to be proud of." And then he was gone. Preston sat there alone, staring at the untouched coffee in front of him. No cameras. No headlines. No one left to clap. Just one man, facing everything he'd lost, in a room where power once meant everything and now meant nothing at all. Some endings don't come with applause. No dramatic music, no slow-motion triumph. Just quiet realizations, and people walking away a little different than before. Zariah stood at the shoreline of Tybee Island, the early morning sun casting gold across the waves. She held a copy of her book in one hand, the breeze flipping its pages as if the wind itself wanted to remember her story. She didn't come here to celebrate. She came to breathe. Behind her was chaos, controversy, a billion-dollar scandal, and a husband who reactivated an empire of silence just to protect her dignity. In front of her was something far scarier. Peace. Because peace meant reflection, and reflection demanded truth. The truth was, Zariah didn't want fame. She didn't want to be a symbol. But in a world where black women are too often erased or used as props in someone else's narrative, her choice not to shrink became an act of rebellion. And her voice? It became a lighthouse. Elsewhere, Preston Hawk sat alone in a small apartment far from the city skyline he once ruled. No assistants, no press releases, just silence and consequences. But this time, he listened. For once, he understood that wealth couldn't erase damage, that apologies too late are just echoes. He started writing, not a book, just letters. To his children, to the people he hurt, to himself. Maybe one day, someone would read them, maybe not, but writing was all he had left that felt real. As for Sal, he returned to the quiet life he had built before the storm. He still made espresso every morning, still walked Zariah to the bookstore on Sundays, still kept his hands clean. But he remained watchful. Because peace, he knew, was never permanent, and he would never be caught off guard again. There's a lesson in all of this. That real strength doesn't come from power, it comes from restraint. That silence, when chosen with purpose, can be louder than any scream. And that justice, true justice, doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes, it walks in with a smile. Sometimes, it serves coffee instead of subpoenas. And sometimes it waits years to speak, just to make sure the world listens when it finally does. This is not the end of Zariah's story. Or Preston's. Or Sal's. Because in a world this complicated, stories don't really end, they evolve. And as the camera fades on this chapter, one question remains. What would you do if someone tried to take your worth away? This is Hidden Worth. And if you've made it this far, you already know. The next part is going to change everything.